Page 37 in a Tractate Shabbat. We're about to study the Shehiya and Achzara. I'm still cold. It's freezing outside. While we're walking here, I was thinking about my mother-in-law. You know the story about my mother-in-law? You see outside it's freezing cold, but the sun rises. So it's like my mother-in-law. She's always smiling, but she never warms you up. No, I'm joking. I think that my mother-in-law is the greatest in the world, and I keep saying as long as she's around. But yeah, it's just one of those cold winter's days. You see the sun outside, you walk in the room, it's still freezing cold. Anyway, 37, what we're going to do today? It's we're going to learn the Shehiya and Achzara. Shehiya is the idea of Shema Yechateh B'Gechalim, that we are concerned about the person that moved the coal, and Achzara meaning that we concerned that he not only Yechateh, moving the coal in order to make it warm, but it also looks like he is cooking. So again, you have a ready product, you take it out of the pot, you bring it back, and while you bring it back, you realize it's too cold. So either you're moving the coal behind it, or you turn around the plate, so it looks like you are cooking on Shabbat. So when it's come to Shabbat, you have to be concerned over three things. One, what we studied yesterday, which is the Bishul Torah, which is the whole idea of the need for anything to pass the first stage, which is Machal Bedrosai. When we explained that Bedrosai, it's applied either to a 1/3 or half, according to Rambam and Ravid, half of cooking, and then it's not the issue of Bishul. The second part is the Isu, the Rabbanon, the Rabbinic, which is Shema Yechateh, the concern that he can move the coal, for example, in order to make it warmer. Or the michzek mevashel, that it looks like he is cooking, even the product is already fully cooked. So here we are at the top of page 37. לעולם ימלך להחזיר תנן בחסור מחסרה ואחי קטנים. So here's the two view, one is the Rashi and one is the others. According to Rashi, the whole idea here, he said, לביאו להשרות אף על פי שאינו גרוף שרי, which means that until a person, the first part of the Mishnah speaks about he should not put it until he is moving the ashes and clean it up so he can do it. In other words, he needs to do it in advance before Shabbat, so you can go ahead and use it even according to Hanania, which is not Groupa, not Ketum, but that's only the close of a Rashi. The opposite way is the other Meforshim that hold that is no concern until he put the whole coal together, which means the issue is if you have inside the stove, he add some gechalim, some coal, and therefore it's covered. So placing a pot inside the oven on Shabbat, it's considered some type of cooking on Shabbat. So the Ramban hold that is basically issue because it's changed the whole status of the cooking on the stove. So here, you ask this question that basically it's like superfluous in the Mishnah, repeat the same thing twice. He said, "V'chasui mechasra v'hachektani." It's going to teach us something like missing in the language of the Mishnah, and it's as follows. כירה שהסיקוה בקש ובלבבה מחזירין עליה תבשיל. If you have a stove that was lit with a straw or racking, one may return the pot, cook food with it. Why? Because you take it in the Friday night and you bring it back. But begefet ubetzim. But if you do it with the palms with wood, so it's different. Lo yachzir, you not return the pot on it. עד שיגרוף או עד שייתן את האפר, until one sweep the coals out while it's still there, until one cover it with coal with ashes. So basically you have to have those conditions in order to make it available. So again, so far what we understand, we learn it from the other phase of the Mishnah that said, aval lashhod. But if you take a product, a food that was fully baked in advance before Shabbat, משכין אף על פי שאינו גרוף ואינו כתוב. Even the כירה in the stove is not yet swept and not covered with ashes, but still you can do it. So in other words, here we ask several questions, which is, let's be practical. Let's think if you have, in nowadays you have a blech, you have a stove, you have a blech, and at the top of the blech you have this type of things, which is ready-made food, or almost ready-made food, and you take it out and you serve it. So basically it's not a problem to bring it back. However, trace a situation that you put it on the ground, and now it's a cold winter. You remember my mother-in-law? It's a cold winter. You put it on the ground and it's freezing cold. Now you bring it back, the temperature is much lower. So now it's different taste. I don't know if you remember, but many years ago in the yeshiva world, used to wake up some of the bochrim early in the morning, and want to taste the chamim early in the morning. So what do? What? They go in the morning, early, 3, 4 in the morning. They take off the cover of the pot, and they start tasting the food. Just a little, it's a large pot. They're taking a little food. So what's the problem? The problem is, number one, I think, it's the whole idea of a megis, that basically when you're taking it out and you're changing the status, because while you're eating, when the pot is on the whatever it is, plata or stove, you're changing the status, right?
Megis meaning the stirring it.
You're stirring it because, let's face it, you don't want just to eat the top. You want to eat, for example, those days people have no fear of cholesterol, so they eat the kishke and all this Ashkenazic stuff, that it's inside, it's dig inside. So they take a large one, nobody sees it, you go inside the pot,
and you
pull it out, and you stir it a little bit, it tastes good. Now, what's the problem? You're basically megis.
So what's the problem with megis? If I stir it, what's going to happen? I make it closer to get cooker fast. To get
Correct. So it's like mechateh begechalim, the same status. It's like moving the coal and the barbecue, because basically you're changing the status of the food, right? Just an example. Or as I said, if you remove it and you're not just holding the pot, you put it down and then you put it back. So again, you enter those domain of problems. That's what we're dealing here with shehiya. So the Gemara says, "Umahen machine," right? What type of food we allow to delay if the kira lo groupa velo ktuma? If the kira is not, you don't take out the ashes and you don't do anything. You just the regular stove situation. Bet Shammai omrim chamin avalot tavshil. Bet Shammai omrim you can use hot water but not cook food. ובית הלל אומרים חמין ותבשיל. בית הלל said both hot water and cook food. Not just that. The second מחלוקת, the second disputation between Hillel and Shammai, so go to a very clear subject in the Mishnah that said lo yiten. What do you understand from that? That you can basically return a cooked food on Shabbat if the kira, if the stove is grufa and ktuma, right? So that's the way the Tana continued, and he said, "V'ha chazara de amrelach," and furthermore, and that return that I said to you, which means at the very beginning part of the Mishnah, that it allowing grufa or ktuma, lav divrei akoli. It's not according to everyone. אלא מחלוקת בין בית שמאי ובית הלל. זה subject to dispute between בית שמאי ובית הלל. שבית שמאי אומרים נוטלין אבל לא מחזירים. Which means בית שמאי said that you can remove but not return. ובית הלל אומרים אף מחזירים. So even you return. So basically what you say here, that the Mishnah coming around beautifully. Why? Because the two disputations between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, they're dealing with two separate subjects, which is The first one is dealing with shehiya. Shehiya meaning the delays time. So again, the whole question is about the interpretation of the Mishnah. Not solved because the first one dealing with shehiya, the second part dealing with chazara, which is kira, that it's both groupa or k'tuma. So again, we are dealing here, if we said lachzir tenan, we're dealing according to Hananya, which means that's according to Beit Hillel, any food that was cooked by the level of Ben Drusai, again, which was either 1/3 or half of cook, you can mashhe, you can leave it on a kira, even that is not garuf and not katum. And if you go by the Chachamim that disagree with Hananya, as they said, lashhot knan, but not lashhot ulachzir, that they're not allowed to return the product back on a kira. So here we're going to elaborate. Tashma, come and hear how we're going to resolve it. The Amar Rabbi Chelbo, Amar Rav Chama bar Guria, Amar Rav Lo Shanu, all of this, what we said, all this header, apply Ela al Gaba, Aval Tocha Asur, which means whatever we said, it's apply only when it's put al Gaba on the top of the kira, because it's not so much heat there. But if you put it inside and they place it the pot on the top of it, so it's
inside of the oven, you mean? Inside.
Yes.
Those days they had
kira. You put it inside, or the cover that you put on the halal. Again, so letocha, the way that the Gemara understands it, it's really at the top of the gechalim, really at the top of the coal, really. That's what Rashi said. So they said here, I amrat bishlama. We understand if you said lehachzir tnan, that the only issue is to return it. So then you understand that it's an issue. Because we're missing in the Mishnah part that allow you to hold, to lashhot, to hold a cooked food before Shabbat, even on kira, that it's not groufa and not katum. So we understand that Rabbi Chelbo tried to limit it, that heter. Hainu deshani, that's clear how we divided ben tocha le'al gaba, between something that it's inside the kira and something on the cover of the kira. Why? Because when you put the food on the top of the coal, that it's inside the kira, that's not garuf and not katum, so it's basically a real hatmana. You really make hatmana in the remets, because that's basically forbidden even on Friday night, right? Because the whole idea is, one of the things we allow in hatmana, it's as long as it's not add more smoke, is דבר שאינו מוסיף אבל. But if it's add the temperature and it's make it higher, then it's a problem. So mali tocha mali gaba. Ela yamat lashotnan, that you said that it's only in kira that is garuf and or katum. So what's the difference if it's on the top or inside? It's not any problem. It's not prohibited, because you already did all the preparations. So you have to go back the way that Hananya said. So now we respond and we said, Mi savar Rabbi Chelbo areisha kai. Do you going to tell me that Rabbi Chelbo hold according to the heter that we hold from the very beginning, which means to delay this part in advance on the top of kira, stove, that it's either garuf or katum, and therefore there is a difference. A seifa kai. Let's go to the second part of the Mishnah, which is Beit Hillel omrim af machzirin. Beit Hillel said that you allow not only a hot water, but even a cooked food, you can bring it back and put it back. He said, "Ve'amar Rabbi Chelbo, Amar Rabbi Chama bar Guria, Amar Rav lo shanu ela al gaba, aval letocha." So that's exactly what you said earlier. That's if you return the food on the top of kira, that it's not garuf and katum, so it's forbidden according to everyone, because it's michzek mevashel. It's appear like it's cooking on Shabbat. So the whole fear of mechate b'gechalim, of taking the core and move it, it's much applicable. So now we try to prove that the whole discussion is not according to Hananya. תשמע שתי קירות המתאימות, אחת גרופה וקטומה ואחת שאינה גרופה ואינה כתומה, משהין על גבי גרופה ותרומה ומשהין על גבי שאינה גרופה ואינה כתומה. So again, let's make it clear. Hashaya, to delay, meaning you're taking the pot that was on the stove and your intent is to serve. And then you have no intent to bring it back. You just take it out and that's it. Then for all kind of reasons you want to put it back. But meanwhile it was a period of time in between, is shahut, is hashaya, that it was in between, right? That it wasn't there. That's one issue. The other one is lehachzir, which means you take it but you have in your mind, you plan to put it back. So here we're dealing with an issue that shtei kirot hamatimot, which is you have two stoves that they are basically together. If there are two stoves that they are in a common wall, and one of them, the coals are swept and covered with ashes, and the other coal are not swept and covered with ashes. So now we ask, since it's like a little bit hole in between them, if one of them, the coal was swept and covered with ashes, and the one coal was not swept and not covered with ashes, the ruling with regard to leaving a pot atop them on Shabbat is as follows. We said, "Umay mashin." בית שמאי אומרים ולא כלום, בית הלל אומרים חמינה ולא תבשיל, which means one may leave food at top of the one who swept or covered it with ashes, and one may not leave the food at the top of one and not swept or covered with the ashes. So we said, Beit Shammai said nothing at all, right? So basically Beit Hillel said one may leave the hot water but not the cooked food. So again, the whole idea is that is basically the fear is that the person see that the temperature change and he wants to make it warm. So Beit Hillel divided between hot water and a cooked food, akar. But if he pull out the food that was sitting on that stove, and it was something that was there before Shabbat, divrei hakol lo yachzir. Everyone said that he cannot take it back. Divrei Rabbi Meir. That's the word Rabbi Meir, which means that he not return to the top of the stove. That's what Rabbi Meir said. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Beit Shammai Omrim. Rabbi Yehuda hold that Beit Shammai said Chamim aval lo tavshir, which means one may leave hot water on it but not cook food. ובית הלל אומרים אף מחזירין, and Beit Hillel said one may leave both, right, hot water and cook food. And basically בית שמאי אומרים נוטלים אבל לא מחזירים, בית הלל אומרים אף מחזירים. בית שמאי said that one may remove a pot from the stove on Shabbat but not return it. Beit Hillel said one may even return it. So you see here, again, soon you see all the halachic implication, the practical halacha with all of this discussion. If you say that case we learned in the Mishna that we got to leaving the pot on the stove, so that's according to Rabbi Yehuda, which means that lashhotnan, that's the way Rabbi Yehuda understand that Beit Shammai forbids to bring it back and Beit Hillel allowed. But if you say that it's returning the stove, so it's according to whom this Mishnah, it cannot be neither Rabbi Yehuda nor Rabbi Meir. Why? If you said that according to Rabbi Meir, so it's difficult for Beit Shammai in respect, and Beit Hillel in two, which means Beit Shammai permits some use of the stove on Shabbat. So, and according to a Braita, Bet Shammai prohibited any use. And the Beit Hillel, it's two different things. According to what we understand, Beit Hillel permit both hot water and cooked food. And what Meir said that the Braita, they said that Beit Hillel permit returning the pot on the stove. That's the opposite of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda, kasher, groufa, וקטומה. If you tell me that the Braita is going to Rabbi Yehuda, so you have the issue of sweeping the coals and covering them with ashes. So you see here that in our Mishnah, when they allow the Mishnah both Beit Hillel and Shammai allow living in the stove, whose coal were not swept or covered with ashes. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, the stove whose coal are neither swept nor covered with ashes may not be used at all. So again, so you have to say La'ashchot nan lo Rabbi Hanania. So the Mishnah will not understood according to that opinion. So they go back and said, okay, actually, what we meant to say that the whole regards in the Mishnah is returning the pot to the stove. And our Tana in the Mishnah speaks according to one matter, according to Rabbi Yehuda, and disagree with him in one matter, which is Savar like Rabbi Yehuda bechada. You hold according to Rabbi Yehuda in one matter. We got the matter to what? So he said, according to this, Bachaminu betavshin utlim machzirin, which means that he holds in Bachaminu tavshin that Beit Hillel allow both hot water and cooked food. In Beit Shammai only chamin. Venutlim machzirin, that Beit Shammai forbids to return it, and Beit Hillel allowed. So that's the מחלוקת. ופליג עליה בחדה, he disagree with Rabbi Yehuda in one Braita. What is it? So he said, דאילו תנא דידן סבר להשהות, אף על פי שאינו גרוף וכתום. At our time I understand that you can hold it, להשהות, which means that they held it and not to leave the pot in the stove is permitted. ורבי יהודה סבר בלהשהות נמי גרוף וכתונין ואילו לא. So even with not swept or covered with ashes, Rabbi Yehuda held with regard to permitting one to leave a pot on the stove as well. If the stove was swept or covered with ashes, yes, it's permitted. If it's not swept or covered with ashes, no, it's not permitted. So that's not according to what we understand from Rabbi Hanania. So you see, so far, several things. The Shulchan Aruch, according to the strict opinion, and that's basically the Bet Yosef. But what you see here, that we divided between Shehiya and Chazara, between the 3 points, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, and the Mishnah. According to Rabbi Meir, when it's not Garuf and not Katum, it's forbidden regardless if it's a Beit Hillel or Beit Shammai. And according to Mishnah, it's only Chamin but not Tavshil. And then Shehiya, if it's Garuf or Katum, there it's a different. Beit Shammai forbids, but they allow Chamin. And it's different between Rabbi Yehuda and the Mishnah. But if it's Garuf or Katum, in regard to Chazara, to return, regardless if it's a hot water or cooked food, so most of them forbids it. The only way that we allow that he allows, it's Rabbi Yehuda according to Beit Hillel. Other than that, everyone said that it's forbidden. So that's basically the discussion. Now we go to a new one. And the new discussion later, at the end of the shiur, we're going to have the practical halacha, and you see how all of these discussions apply to halacha. We really try to do abbreviation because we're running out of time, otherwise we'll elaborate on that. When we're dealing with stove that neither swept nor covered, so we ask a question, Mahu lismoch ba? Can we put this cooked food on the ground, on the side of the stove? So can we lean the cooked food, the cooked dish against it, so maybe heat it from the side of the stove? So they said, if you said tocha ve'gaba asur aval lismoch ba shapir dam me'udilma lo shna. If you tell me it was the placing the pot inside and the top, it's prohibited, but we lean the pot against it, it may well do so. Or we say the opposite, leaning it's no difference and it's prohibited in every case. So tashma, shte kirot hamat'imot. So if you see that the two kiro, that there are two stoves that they are together, and he said, "Achad גרופה וקטומה ואחד שאינה גרופה וקטומה, משין על גבי גרופה וקטומה." So if you have two stoves, one that was swept and covered with ashes, and one was not swept and covered with ashes, so one may leave cooked food at top of the stove that's swept and covered with ashes on Shabbat. So he said, ואפיה גבי כסליק להבלה מאידך, even though the heat rises from the other stove. And what we said earlier that if it's mosif chom, if it's mosif heating, even it's not garuf, so by attaching it, you're basically raising the temperature. So they said, no, dilma shane atam, maybe in that case of the two stoves, it's different. Why? The kevan the midalya shalit ba'avira, because since the pot is elevated, so the air affects it and it cools it. So it's not, you cannot call it leaning against the stove. It's not the same. Tashma da marav safra marav chia ktama. What?
I'm sorry, just to make it clear. So the raya here, the Gemara wanted to say, for the fact that we have two kira, on the Gorofa וקטומה we could put, on the other one we cannot put. Mm-hmm. So what's the raya? The Gemara wants to bring a raya from here, that samoch is mutar, it's asur.
Yes.
Samoch is mutar, or is asur. The Paishut, it's asur, right? Because even on the side,
right.
Right. You cannot put it there. Why you cannot put there?
Because you gain more heat because
from the one
neighbor, from the one next to you.
So it's a right that you cannot put, right?
That's what I understand. Because the minute you add more, what the concept of mosif have, that you add more and you heat it indirectly. By having the neighbor next to them, one part affected the other. That's what we try to say. Katma, if you cover it with the coal, that's what Afia said. Venitlabda, which means that subsequently it's reignited on Shabbat. So we can lean the pot against it. Why? Somchim lab, you put it the other part, ומקמים עליה ונוטלים ממנו מחזירים מה. שמאמינה לסמוך נמה וקטומה אין לא קטומה לא. So you see it basically by some people, they have like kli sheni. So they have one attached to the other, and basically it brings some heat, but it's not adding and it's not cooking the food that was on the top of the other. By the way, the chazonishnikes, people who follow chazonish, they don't put anything even on the top of the blech. They put always something in between, and then they put the food to make sure that there's any form of bishul. The truth of the matter, it somehow makes sense, because let's face it, if you take uncooked vegetable and you put it on the stove, on the blech, and you leave it, it will cooked.
Right. Even if it started out uncooked. But I mean, if it started out cooked,
yes.
You're not changing the state.
Right? So they say, uletamich, that all Rav Chia said it's applied to specifically kira ktuma, notlim mimena dektane ktama en lo katma lo. So what we said, that according to opinion that was taught, that one may remove the food from it, so he said it's cover them, yes. If it not cover them, no. So you can take the food even it's not katum. Right? You have to say that you remove due to the fact that it's taught that you have a permission to return it. So here he taught the permission to leave the pot due to the fact that he taught permission to leave the pot on a stove. So a conclusion cannot be drawn that leaning a pot on an unswept stove is prohibited. Okay? Hachayashta. So now the Gemara asks on this comparison. How do you make this comparison? Hatam, in regard to taking out the food and return it with the pot, so you basically take from one location, return in the same location, Rashi said, so there is no difference. So therefore, we clear why Rav Chia said, Tana Notlim, Mishum Machzirim. Again, as we said earlier, having you intent to bring it back. When you put two together, one next to the other, Somchim Bechad Makomu. That you put the one attached to the other, Umekaimim Bechad Makomu. But right in the different location. So Maya Vetala. So what we learned from all of that? What's the conclusion? Tashma. Kigashi Sikwa Begefet Ve'etzim Somchin La. If you have a stove that was lit with a pumice or with wood, you 1 meal in a pot of cooked food against it. Gechalim Shamemu. If it's some type of coal, a dim, or which is ocean atana le'ane ocean pishtandaka, on which a stripe of tiny beaten flax was placed. K'ktuma. So it's considering a skatum. So you see in the Braita that you put one side by the other, even Grufa and Ktuma. So now we continue the question about Shehiyah. What's the question? Even though it's not covered with ashes or swept out, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak בר נחמני אמר רבי יהושע כתמה והבערה משין עליה חמין שהוא חמו כל צרכה ותבשיל שבשל כל צרכו. So he said, with regard to the stove that was covered with ashes and reignited on Shabbat, one may leave hot water that was already completely heated and cooked food that was already completely cooked upon it. So there is no need for additional cooking. Why? Because it's already cooked. So you don't worry that one can go ahead and stoke the coals or ignite the fire. So we turn the page and now we say, Shma mina mitztamek ve'yafelo mutar. Let me share with you some point. What is a mitztamek ve'yafelo? You have a food. The food is somehow cooked but not fully cooked. But by putting it on the sintered stove or certain temperature, in one hand the food can be smaller inside, but it's ve'yafelo. It makes the product a better product, which means by having the food, for example, vegetable, shrinking, ve'yafelo, it makes it taste better. So, in other words, average person, have the intent to leave the food for longer time in order for the food to be smaller, but by the same manner, it's better for the product itself. That's one concept. There is an opposite concept, which is mitztamek veralo, meaning that by having the product, making it smaller, for example, meat, pieces of meat, if make it smaller, so it's less taste, less desirable for people to eat. So here we learn that by adding more time to the product, it turned to be mitztamek ve'yafelo, it's make it better. By the way, all this chiluk, all this difference between mitztamek ve'yafelo, mitztamek veralo, apply only to something that it's already hitbashel kol tzorko, which means it was fully cooked in the highest level. Because if it does not cook fully, like ben drusai, so any tavshil, any product that you leave on the stove to be cooked, automatically it's ve'yafelo, because you improve the quality of the food and the potential that people wanted to have the extension of the time of cooking. So here we are speaking about mitztamek ve'yafelo, and therefore mutar, we are allowed to leave it on the stove, that it's not garuf and katum. So the Gemara rejected and said, Shale hacha diktama. Here you have to say that it's different because he basically ktama. What? Yes. So here כירה שהיא not גרופה אינה כתומה, so you cannot leave anything on that. Excluding is a תבשיל, is any product that it's cooked enough and מצטמק ורע לו, like חמין, right? Now, if it's kira, גרופה or כתומה, so you can leave it any type of food that it wasn't cooked enough. And the third one, if it's kira, if it's a stove that it's already נקטמה וחזרה והובערה, which means that it's reprocessed several times, so that's a מחלוקת הראשונים, what you can do and how you can do. So in conclusion, that part, יהכה מיילה ממרה. So the Gemara asks, what is the din of Rabbi Shah wants to teach us? והבערה is צריכה ליה. You need the halacha that it's necessary to warm it, because then by taking the coals and move them after the ktima, so you thought at the beginning that it necessarily require additional articulation. Let's say that since it's reignited, it returned to its original status and is prohibited. So they teach us that it's not the case. So meaning, because he retroactively he stopped thinking of Bishul, because he made the ktima in advance, so he can leave any product that it needs to make via fellow, even that it's basically did it in addition. Not everyone goes along with that. Soon you see that there are others who disagree. But to wrap it up so far, what we understand, we learn now a new concept that it's called מצטמק ויפלו, מצטמק ורע לו. Later at the end of the shiur, we're going to bring the halachot when it's come to a food that was shriveled and improved, or shriveled and disapproved, which means turned to be smaller.
אמר רבא בר חנא אמר רבי יוחנן, כתמה והובהרה משהין עליה חמין שהוא חמו כל צרכן, ותבשיל שבישל כל צורכו, ואפילו גחלים של רותם. Again, let's refresh our memory in order to make sure that we are the same level. We learn several new definitions, and we need to clearly understand each of those definitions. We learn the definition of שהייה, החזרה, גרופה, כתומה, הטמנה. Let's go over those definitions to make sure that we are very clear on those. First and foremost, let's see just a phase from practical halacha, and you see why those discussions are so important. The Torah tells us very clearly in several places that we cannot cook on Shabbat. Meaning, a person cannot initiate any form of cooking on Shabbat. Not necessarily or only by turning on a fire. It can cook even with something like fire that existed before Shabbat. Such as, even we have our own contemporary stove, and on the top of the stove we have, which we call, for example, blech, or those who use plata for Shabbat. How do you call this plata? Shabbat plata?
Platter.
That's the
plate.
The one that you connected to the electricity.
Yeah.
Oh, hot plate you mean?
Hot plate, thank you. Or you have a hot plate. By putting a food, for example, if you take uncooked vegetable, that in order for you to eat them, you need to cook them, and you take those vegetables directly on the hot pot or even on a blech. So basically, by putting that food and leaving them, they will be cooked on Shabbat. Now, here are more detailed or even a little complicated issues. Since the Torah forbade us any form of bishul, any type of cooking on Shabbat, now we enter the domain of question what exactly the Torah meant in a certain circumstance. For that sense, we need the tradition from our rabbis to explain to us clearly what we can do or what we cannot do. What are the disputations? One issue is, if I put a uncooked food before Shabbat and the food was staying there, for example, this weekend Shabbat, the clock changed and Shabbat begins earlier, and in a hectic day I do not have sufficient time to prepare the food properly, yet I need to feed my family and my guests with a ready food for Shabbat. Therefore, I'm beginning the process of cooking before Shabbat, leaving on the, for example, hot pot, a food that will carry on and continue to be cooked on Shabbat. Is that okay? Or another option, if I take uncooked food and put it on a blech, but then after 5 or 10 or whatever it is hours, it will be fully cooked. Is that okay? Next question. What happens if the food is fully cooked in advance and I'm pulling out the pot, now doing the meal on Friday night, serving the people with the pot, and then want to put it back on the hot pot? That's called shehiyah. Shehiyah speaks about a situation that it's in between. The food is cooked, I'm taking it out, I'm serving it, and then I want to return it. Here we enter the domain of מחלוקת. It's a dispute. Beit Shammai, for example, hold that you cannot do it. Beit Hillel said you can do it with a certain condition, such as you need to have something in between, for example the blech. As long as you don't put it on direct fire, Beit Hillel will go along with shehiyah. I wish that it's so clear and simple. Why? Because even according to Beit Hillel, there are certain situations that even Beit Hillel, who usually more lenient, will not allow you to do it. What does that mean? Imagine if you live in Siberia or Alaska or places that it's a freezing cold, 20 below zero, or 50 or 30 below zero. You pull out the food from the stove, from even at the top of the blech, you're serving it, and then you put it on the floor, right? And you say Dvar Torah. And now the food was on the floor for a couple of minutes, the whole temperature changed. Now you want to put it back on the blech or on the hot pot. Even Beit Hillel said it's a problem. Okay? But this concept, just for our understanding, it's shehiyah, which means you take it, but basically you do not have fully intent to return it. But then you want to. Maybe the food is too cold. There is a concept of hachzara, that you take it but you have a full intent to return it and for example you're just taking a soup, or you take something that it's, because earlier we divided between liquid and non-liquid, but you take it out, you're serving, but you have full intent to return it. In ancient time, it was a different stoves. It was those stoves that have those walls in both sides that you need to take out the ashes. And then because it was a lot of quarrels, like when in our days we're doing barbecue, so we explained yesterday, when you're making a barbecue, making whatever it is, I'm not eating that, but let's say steaks or whatever it is, and you go there and you realize it's not fully cooked or it's not ready, what do? You take the coral and you start moving them around, boom, 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 right? And as a result, it's bringing the flame out and fully cooked. So here we have a concern. In the ancient time, it was a concern because people see that the food is not fully cooked, and then they're going ahead and make changes. So here we divided between a situation that is garuf and katum, which means you put the ashes in advance and you set it up, versus if you put some type of rock or stone in between and you clean up the ashes on the walls of the stove, and as a result you may use it. So all of those definitions we learned so far, which is hashaya, hachzara, garuf or grufa, ktuma or katum, okay, and hatmana. Hatmana, let's explain it again. Hatmana meaning you taking something from, for example, hot pot or even direct fire, but you take it in advance, even before Shabbat, and you put it in some temperature, such as 3 heavy blankets, for example, or other resources, and you wrap it in such a way that it maintains the temperature in a level that when you're about to serve that food will have about the same temperature as at the present time. That called hatmana, and that permissible with one condition, as long as it's not add more, they call it mosif hevel, which means you add an additional smoke, which means you raise the temperature. As long as you are not in a position that you, by doing so, you're raising the temperature of the food, it is permissible to do hatmana. Is everything okay? Okay, so now go to Rabbi Bar Chana. Rabbi Bar Chana said, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, excuse me, with regards to a stove, the person swept out or covered it with ashes before Shabbat, and subsequently reignited on Shabbat, one may leave hot water that was already completely heated and cook food that was already completely cooked upon it, even if the coals were from the wood of the broom tree. It's called rotem, which are very hot and long burning. So here basically Rashi explained that there is a pasuk in Tehillim, Gachalei Retamim, that it's Retamim, it's the broom tree, it's appear that it's already, it's burned. But the truth is, it's keep the temperature and it's hot. Sometimes when you're dealing with coal, those who are in a service, they know how it works. It appear in one way, but when you get in close and touch them, it's different, right? So here the rotem, the broom tree, are very hot and very long burning. So he said, even that it was made with broom tree, right, that it's not quickly to be extinguished, it's fine, you can do it. Shma mina, you learn from that, mitztamek veyafelo mutar. Let's again reinforce or clarify the concept of mitztamek veyafelo. Food, those who involved with the food business, like Eddie or like Steve. Eddie does that, 22 years for the President of the United States? All right. So, he knows a little bit food business. So he will tell you, all of our chef, Yehuda and Steve, all they have a great credit, not only Eddie. So they'll tell you that there is a different category of culinary, of making the food. There is certain food that the longest you cook it, in one hand, for example, the vegetable can become smaller and shrink. But on the other hand, shrinking the food and cooking it longer time will make it better. That's called mitztamek, make it smaller, ויפלו, but it makes the product better taste, better product, better food, better intent to eat. There is an opposite way, which soon we're going to learn, mitztamek veralo. Guess what does that mean? That you take a vegetable and you cook it, and the longest you cook the vegetable, it turns smaller. However, the quality is less and less and less. A good example, take for example beef or meat, which I don't eat, but it's good to know. So if you take beef, certain type of beef, if you overcook it, what happened? It shrinked and it lost its taste. Okay? So here back to our sugya, we said Shma Mina, can we learn from what Rabbi Bar Chana said, that even a cooked food, that it's mitztamek, that the shrivels, and by shriveling is improved. You can leave it on the stove, that it's not garuf and katum. And remember, we already defined garuf and katum, so now I'm going to use garuf and katum a lot, and you know already what I'm talking about. So they said, no, shane hacha diktama. Here it's different. Why? Because what Rabbi Yochanan speaks about, if he katam all this stuff, he make it katum. So basically what they do, he retroactively tells us that by prolonging the cooking, it's not something that you wish to do. So the Gemara asks a question: Ihache, if so, Maile Meimra. What's the purpose of saying this halacha? So they answer, and they said, Huv'ara itztrichalei. So the reason is because if he reignited on Shabbat, was necessary, because it's going to tell you that even the stove was turned on and it's on before Shabbat, you can use it. So they said Hainuhach. So the Ritva said, what's the difference between what we said previously and what we said now? It looks about the same. So they said, no. You know what's the difference? Gechalim shel rotem itztrichalei. This is one to tell us something that we never know. That the broom tree, even that it's a hot coal, it's permitted. Why? Because you may think so a broom tree that it's burned, and it's burned long, and it's burned after the person katam, after the person prepared them. So you may say that it's returned to the original status, and therefore you don't use them the same as use the others. Why? Because it appears that they're already extinguished, even they are not. So they come and tell us that regardless the way that it's appear, as long as they are hot and can have a potential to cook something, we use them or judge them equally to others. And that's something we didn't know earlier. So what do we understand so far? According to Rabbi Yochanan, he allowed to leave, to do hashaya on a stove that it's not garuf and katum, only fully cook food. And that food, by staying there, is mitztamek veralo. That's the way Rabbi Yoshaya said. So again, he hold the same Chachamim and Rabbi Hanania, that it was that you can leave on a stove, that it's not garuf and katum, even cook the food that cook in a level of bendrosai, which is bendrosai, we said that it's either 1/3 or a half cooked food, but that's the only one they allow. Remember, when we talk about the early Hanania, we speak about a situation that what we allow to do, it's if you have indirect connection to a fire. So let's again be practical. If you have a stove and you cook food on a stove and you take that food out of the stove, if you want to return it, you can't. Only Beit Hillel allow it with one condition, that you have, which the garuf and katum in our language, it's like a blech. So you do not put it directly on a fire. But even Beit Hillel has certain condition. So what we understand, Amar Rav Sheshet, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, כירה שהיא סיכוע בגפת ובעצים. He said a stove that was with a pomace, with wood. So he said, which means that it's not garuf and it's not katum. So he said, משהין עליה חמין שלא הוחמו כל צורכן ותבשיל שלא בישל כל צורכו. So you can leave on Friday before Shabbat even water that it's not fully heat, or food in a level of bendrosai. You remember bendrosai? What is the level of bendrosai? Remind me.
1/3 or 1/2, depending.
Excellent. So you hold, as long as the water or the food, right, in the level of bendrosai, you can mashhe, you can leave from Friday night. However, עקר לא יחזיר עד שיגרוף או עד שייתן עליהן, עד שייתן אפר. So he said, however, if he is already taken עקר, which means he removed the food from the stove, so one may only return it if he sweep the coals out. That's called grifa, and all of that in condition that he did it while it's still a day, excuse me, or he places the ashes on the coal, which is called yiten efer, putting the ashes on the coal. Kasavar. So what we understand from that? That he hold, Rabbi Yochanan, the matnitin le'achazir tnan, that the Mishnah speak about returning the cooked food to the stove. Aval lashhot, however, with leaving a pot on the top of the stove, mashin af al pi she'eino garuf ve'eino katum. That's exactly what Hanania said, which may mean that one may leave it on the stove even if it's not swept and not covered with ashes, and that's exactly what Hanania said. So either you learn lehachzir tnan or lashhot tnan. So you see here that what we understand by Rabbi Yochanan, that the Mishnah speak about lehachzir tnan. So here the Gemara have a problem with that. Rava Amar Rava Travayu Tananhi, which is the both of these dinim that Rav Sheshet said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, which is that you allow to do ashhaya of any cooked food even on the top of a stove that it's not garuf, which means it's not swept and not katum, right? And you cannot return any cooked food only if you swept the kol garuf and katum. So we basically learn it in a Mishna. So all these heter apply to what? Lashhot, which means that it's permitted to live on a part of on the stove. Tanina, we learn early in page 19, ein notnim et hapat betoch hatanur, one may not put the bread into the oven, which is on Friday and Erev Shabbat, im chashecha, which means when it's still daytime, but it's close to the time of the Shekiah. By the way, it's important to read the Tosfot Yom Tov. He explained that it's only if it's close to the Shekiah. But anyway, it's all in order to make sure that later it complete the process of baking, and that process will complete when it's already Shabbat. So you cannot do that. In other words, you cannot take uncooked challah that you prepared, let's say at 4:10 this Friday night. He hold when it's very close to the Shkia. Let's say Shabbat start what time? 4:30, 4:40. So let's say So let's say at 4:25 you cook a challah, right? And it's not even beginning of the process, and you leave it on the stove. So he said you can't do it. Velo it charara al gabe gechalim. Charara is like a cake, a small cake, on the top of the coal. Ela kedei shikremu fanea, which means the only allow it is if the surface will form a crust. So you see that it's already ready product. Then if it's sufficient that you see the brownie coming out, right, or it's a crust before Shabbat, then you can do it. Because when the bread begin its process of cooking, you see that the external part of the bread or the cake, it's became a crust, right? So that's basically what we call early ma'achal ben dostai. The Ritva said, how do you recognize ma'achal ben dostai nowadays? How do you say it's 1/3? You say half. So he hold when you see the change of color of the surface will form a crust, so you hold that that's already in a category of ma'achal ben dostai. So what we say that if it's not in that category and it's now 4:20, you cannot do that. So what we understand, ha karmu fanea shari, which means if you see that this cake or this bread has already a crusted outside of, which means it changed its color from very, very pale color to a crusty color. So it means even later you and I knew that the completion of the process will take place during Shabbat, but since the level of ma'achal ben dostai and the level of being crusted took place before Shabbat, therefore you can go ahead and do that, which means that we go by the idea of Hanania, that you can leave, you do shehiyah, you can leave a cooked food that it wasn't fully cooked on a stove, that it's not garuf and katum. And the same thing is the second din of Rabbi Yochanan that said lehachzir, if you return a cooked food on the stove on Shabbat, Namei Tanina, we also learn in the Mishnah. Beit Hillel omrim af machzirin. Beit Hillel said that you can return the cooked food on the stove. Ve'ad kan lo kasharu Beit Hillel, and up to this point, Beit Hillel did not allow to return ela v'grufa וקטומה, which means they permitted to return the pot in a stove when it's swept and covered with ashes. Remember, geruf katum, swept and covered with the ashes. אבל בשאינה גרופה וקטומה לא. However, in one that it's not swept or covered with ashes, they did not allow it. So what we learn? We learn from the Mishnah itself that you cannot return any type of food back on the stove only if it's swept or covered with ashes, garuf vekatum, which means 2 points that Rav Sheshet said from the Mishnah. It's come clear. So they said, "V'Rav Sheshet diuke dematnitin kamash melan." Rav Sheshet is also came to teach us that we learn from this Mishnah, but not to introduce a new halacha, which means that the whole idea of Chazara that Rabbi Yochanan said, it's nothing new. We don't learn that this is something new, that we're allowed to do Shehiyah, that it wasn't clear in the previous Mishnah, but we learn it from the Diuk, which what is the Diuk? We said, Ha karmu faneh shari, which means if you have the color change to a crusty color, so then you can do it. So that's something new that Rabbi Yochanan come to teach us. So let's understand it clearly. What we understand so far, that if you have a food, if now it's Friday and it's 4:22, and you said, "Oi, I don't have enough food for Shabbat. I want to make a cake. I want to make a challah roll." And now you prepare it. Time to light candles is 4:30, let's say 7. Now, can you put it on a stove and cook it or not? What did he say? Yes or no?
No.
No.
How about yes? When you said yes,
Well, if you can actually cook it at least at a third,
which is, how do you recognize it?
well, was so that you'd have a crust on it that won't stick to the side of
Excellent.
the oven. So
So that's what Rabbi Yochanan teaches. Beautiful, beautiful. I'm proud of you. Rabbi Yochanan teaches something beautiful. He wants to tell us that if you know that it's a richer point of Ben Drosai, which the Ritva tell us that Ben Drosai meaning that you see a crusted outside of the product, if that happened mi be'od yom before Shabbat, then Rabbi Yochanan gave us a chidush and he said, Share, you can do it. Is that clear? Now, they have the third version of Rabbi Yochanan's. And the third version goes like this. Amar Rav Shmuel. Amar Rav Shmuel. Bar Yehuda, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. כירה שהיא סיכוע בגפת ובעצים, משהין עליה תבשיל שבישל כל צורכו וחמין שהוא חמו כל צורכן, ואפילו מצטמק ויפה לו. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yehuda, name of Rabbi Yochanan, said as follows. He said, if you have a stove that you cook it with, for example, wood, and you did it when? On Friday. So you can leave the cooked dish that was already completely cooked, the same as water that was already completely heated, and even you leave it in such a period, you prolong the period that it's the fire is shriveled and improves, right? which means what we said earlier, that if it's mitztamek ve'ralo is one thing, but if it's mitztamek ve'afelo, which means that it makes the product what? Better. So he said, even it's mitztamek ve'afelo, you can do that. Which means Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda that hold that Rabbi Yochanan hold the same as the Chachamim, as the sages, that they forbidden to eat any type of food that it wasn't fully cooked on the top of a stove, that it doesn't make a garouf and katum. But he said that if the product it's mitztamek ve'yafelo, which means if the product by being shrink, it make the product better. So he hold a new halacha in the Hilchot Shehiyah. What's the halacha? He disagree with what we said earlier on Rabbi Bar Chana, which means that Rabbi Bar Chana also hold that you cannot delay or cannot put any cooked product that it mitztamek v'yafelo on the top of a stove that it's not garuf and katum, only if you made it in advance. He hold like Hanania that you can leave a product on the top of the stove that it's not garuf and katum, even a food that it's not fully cooked, with one condition, that it's mitztamek v'yafelo, which means that makes it better. So that's, by the way, big מחלוקת. I wish to have the time. If it wasn't Daf Yomi, we spent a couple of days on this. It's a מחלוקת between the Ritva and the Rashba and more. So what we understand so far, let's wrap it up so far before we carry on. We understand there is a concept that's called bashel kol tzorko, that's something that is fully cooked, and we understand that there are two concepts with that. One it's mitztamek v'yafelo, and one it's mitztamek v'ralo. Mitztamek v'yafelo meaning that by leaving the product and cook, it make it better. Ralo, it shrink, but it reduce the quality. According to Rabbi Bar Chana, if it's mitztamek v'yafelo, it's forbidden. If it's mitztamek v'ralo, it's allowed. According to Rav Sheshet, what we understand, if it's mitztamek v'yafelo, is allowed. If it's mitztamek v'ralo, allowed. According to Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda, if it's the same. If it's a mitztamek v'yafelo or mitztamek v'ralo, it's allowed. How about if it's lo nitbashel kol tzorko, which means it's like it's not in the level of ma'achal ben drosai, which means that it's not cooked yet, even is 1/3 or half of the. So according to Rabbi Bar Chana, it's forbidden. However, according to Rav Sheshet and Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda, even it's not in the level of ma'achal ben drosai, you can do it, and that's a chidush. Amar le'ahu mederabanan leRav Shmuel Bar Yehuda. They don't mention the name, but one of the sages said to Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda, either he was like Avi, that doesn't want to be on the camera, or whatever it is, the guy doesn't want to be recognized. So he said to Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda, Ha Rav Shmuel the Amri Travayu mitztamek v'yafelo asu. Here, both Rav and Shmuel said, contrary to your opinion, that if food is shriveled and improved when you put it on a stove, leaving it there on Shabbat is prohibited. And basically that's the opposite of what we said. So the Ritva said that it's like awkward, it's like weird statement. And he said that this student wasn't in the Beit HaMidrash when they have this discussion. So when he came in, he asked that question, which means he doesn't realize the last discussion. Anyway, so they respond and he said to him, Amar le Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda answered, and he said to him, Atu let ana yada דאמר רב יוסף, אמר רב יוסף, אמר רב יהודה, אמר שמואל, מצטמק ויפה לו אסור, כי כאמינא לך לרבי יוחנן כאמינא. He said, if food, don't you know that Rav Yosef said, name that Rav Yehuda said, Rav Shmuel said that if food shrivels and improve when left on fire for the extended period, it is prohibited to leave it there? When I said to you that it's permissible to leave it, I said in the opinion what's the Rabbi Yochanan said. Amar lei Rav Ukva mi Meishan le Rav Ashi. Meishan is name of the place. The Gemara in Kiddushin said that it's a name of a place that it's close to Babylon. So he said to Rav Ashi, Atun de mekarvitu le Rav Shmuel avidu ke Rav Shmuel. Anan na'aved ke Rabbi Yochanan. He said, you are close to the place where Rav Shmuel lives, so you do according to Rav Shmuel. I live according to Rabbi Yochanan because in other words, they go by the location. Rabbi Yochanan is more lenient. So in other words, Rav Ukva hold that the basic halacha is going by Rabbi Yochanan, which means that you can leave on the stove that it's not garuf and katum, any type of food that it mitztamek veyafelo. You can do that. But those who live in Babylon that go more stringent, they strict in the way that they Rabbeim, which is Rav and Shmuel, they cannot change their minhag because it's like a neder that you cannot change. The Rashva and the Ritva explains, and also Maharatz Chayot said the same thing. You remember the Mishnah we said at the beginning of chapter 4 in Psachim. The Mishnah said that a person cannot change his minhag from one location to another. So here, because Rav and Shmuel are more strict and they're not allowed to leave the product on the stove, if it's a mistamek v'yafelo, so therefore you can go by Rabbi Yochanan who was more lenient, you have to go by Rabbeim Rav Shmuel. So in regard to this matter, Omar le'abaye le'Rav Yosef ma'u lashot. Since again our discussion is about Shiyah and Chazara, he asked, what's the ruling in regard if you need to leave the food on a stove from Shabbat Eve? So can you do that when it's not garuf and not katum? So Abaye in general bring this question, and he doesn't give the specification of that food. Tosfot tells us that Abaye asked about food that wasn't fully cooked, and basically what Abaye meant to ask, if we're going by halacha according to Chachamim or according to Hanania, or maybe he asked about the food like it's mitztamek v'yafelo. So in other words, he holds the same as the sages, and therefore he just asked if halacha is according to Rabbi Shmuel or according to Rabbi Yochanan. But it's clear that his question, it's not about food that in mitztamek v'ralo, because everybody agree that if it's a mitztamek v'ralo, you can make the hashaya. It's not the question. The question is if it's mitztamek v'yafelo, which is improvement. Amarle, so they respond to him. Rav Yosef said to him, Ha Rav Yehuda mashulei ve'achil. Because if you look at Rabbi Yehuda, he allowed to use a stove that it's not fully swept, right? And therefore it's allowed. That even you tell me that they did it for Rav Yehuda without his knowledge, but if he knew that this is forbidden, he will comment and he will not eat it. But by the merely fact that he allowed it, he said that that's a proof that it's okay. So he said, Amarle, Abaye said to Rav Yosef, Bar minei de Rav Yehuda. You can't go by Rav Yehuda that he has his own minhag. Why? The kevan de mesukanu. Rav Yehuda was sick, and you have a different halachot. You remember we talked in Shmirat Shabbat Kilchata, what of Shlomo Zalman, Rav Neuvert, explained to us a different halachot when it's come to sick person, different category. So Rav Yudah was a chole mesukan, which means that he was a dangerously ill. It was a serious situation. Afilu b'Shabbat, you don't even ask, because even it's Shabbat itself, you allow him to do a lot of things, permitted to heat up for him food for Shabbat. It's if it's a dangerous, life in dangerous, then it's a different story. Rashi explains that Rabbi Yudah have the issue that he have a sudden attack, sudden, and then any time that happened, for example, in those days it was called bolmus, which means suddenly person feel tremendously hungry or tremendously thirsty. So he has to have always close to him something, or people who need insulin, diabetic, etc. They have to have chocolate all the time close to them, because otherwise they can get insane or can even die. So he is in different category. You can cook for him on Shabbat, because if you don't find, the Rashba and Ritva said, if you cannot find a cook food for him, you have to cook for him even on Shabbat. It's a life in dangers. But that's not any type of source, they said, because it's different. But li velach mai, but about me and you, or you and me, it's different. What we should do? People who are healthy, can we leave a cooked food on the stove that it's not garuf and katum? So he said, Amarlei, Rav Yosef responded to him and he said, Besura mashhu. He said in Surah, they leave the food on the stove from the Erev Shabbat, and he said that's the har of Nachman bar Yitzchak, Mare de'uv dahava. That Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak was a person, he was born in Surah, and he was a very pious person, and therefore, umashu levachil, that is a person with such a good deeds, and is very very meticulous in the doing mitzvot, and they leave food for him and you'll eat it. So you see here that it's an example. Surah, by the way, it was one of the central part of study Torah. It was a Pumpedita, it was Nahada, it was Surah. That was one of the center of Torah life. Story in regard to that. Amar Rav Ashi, Ka'imna Kamei de Rav Huna. One Shabbat, I was an assistant, a servant to the great master Rav Huna, and I served him. It wasn't Rav Huna, the student of Rav, but it was another Rav Huna. So he said, "Veshahin le'elei kasa deharsena." And what happened is, they saw that they left fish fried in oil. It's called kasa de harsena. It's a fried fish that was a popular dish in Babylon and was commonly eaten by the poor. So it's made primarily with a small flour-coated salted fish, fried in oil with vinegar. In harsena, it's not clear, but probably it's connected to the Syrian word harsena, which is a fish live among the rocks or in the water. So that's the food of the poor people. They used to eat it. So they made it for him at the top of the stove on Shabbat. And they said that he ate it, ואכל, ולא ידענה אם משום דקסבר מסתמק ויפה ומותר, אם משום דכיוון דאית בימיכה מצטמק ורע הוא לא. So I'm not so sure why he ate it, either because he held that mitztamek v'yafelo mutar, that if it's a shrivel and improved by leaving it in the stove a long time, it's allowed, or it's because this dish has flour in it, and therefore here is a shrivel and veralo is deteriorates. So everyone will say that if it's a mistamek veralo, you can leave food that it's a shrivel and deteriorated, you can leave it. That's everyone agree. The only question we have if it's improved, but if it's deteriorated, we agree that it's fine. So he said, what we learned so far, that everyone agreed that if the food deteriorated, you can leave it. That's something we agree. Amar Rav Nachman, מצטמק ויפה לו אסור, מצטמק ורע לו מותר. He said, let's make it clear. He said, if it's a shrivel and improves, when you leave it at this stove is prohibited. Because by leaving it, what happened? You improve the quality of the product, right? But if it's the opposite, is the shrivel and deteriorated, it's permitted. Klala de milta. The key point here, the rule is, kol de'it bamicha mistamek veralo, levar mitavshil delifta. He said, any food that has flour that is shrivels and deteriorates, excluding this type of food, a turnip dish, which even though it was flour shrivels and improve, but it's apply only to what? When there is meat in it. דאף על גב דאית במיכה מצטמק ויפה לו, ואני מילה דאית בביסרה, only if they have meat. So if you have meat, so adding more time to the process of cooking make the product better. Why? Because all the fat that involved in the meat, it's coming out and it's reduce the meat. But they said, אבל לית בביסרה מצטמק ורע לו הוא. But if it's no meat involved, so it's מצטמק is a shrivel and is deteriorated. וכי בביסרה נמי, לא אמרן אלא דלא קבע אלא אורחין. All of that, if it's have meat, we speak about when he doesn't have a guest. So that's different. But אבל קבע אלא אורחין מצטמק ורע לו. But if he has a guest, so what's the problem? If it's a shrivel and deteriorated, so he wants, it's not nice to serve guests with overcooked food. So it's not right, it's not aesthetic, it's not, usually you bring to a guest the best you have. So therefore, lifda, daisa, vetamrei, mitztamek verale. So living dishes made of lifda, which is like figs, right? It's a Greek word, lafda, which is the some type of figs, and porridge and date. If you leave those food on the stove, it causes them to shrivel and deteriorates. So therefore, according to Rashi and Tosfot, that they hold the same as Hanania, so we hold that all this food, it's mitztamek, it's became smaller, but it's improved the quality. Because otherwise, if it's a mitztamek veralo, you don't have this issue of shehiya, you don't have the same category. Which means, if you have any type of stove that it's not garuf and katum, but and you have a product that even it's machal ben drosai, which means that it's not cooked enough, he says that as long as you put it earlier, it's one thing, but if it's fully cooked, you cannot return it back to the stove on Shabbat. That's the key point here. Practical Halacha Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim 353. שתי קירות המתאימות. If you have two stoves that one attached to the other, so and they have in between a common wall, and one of them the coals were swept or covered with ashes, and the other coal are not swept or covered with ashes, permitted to leave a pot at the top of the stove in which the coals are swept or covered with ashes. That's the Braita tells us. Now on Shabbat, notlim umachzirim. So that's the Magen Avraham and also the Rambam in Hilchot Shabbat chapter 3. He said, on Shabbat, if one removes a pot or cook food from the stove in which the coals were swept or covered with ashes, or a stove that was lit with straw and reckoning, he is permitted to return the pot to the stove on Shabbat, as long as the pot is not cooled off completely. That's the Magen Avraham. That's, by the way, halakha of Rabbi Hillel and Hanania. That's the halakha we study today. Another important halakha is kira she sikua begesfet uve'etzim. It is permitted to place a pot of cooked food against the side of a stove that was lit with a pumice or wood, even if the coals were not swept or covered with ashes. The Rama added, and he said it is permitted to do so even on Shabbat itself. The Rambam and the Ramban, they are prohibited doing it. The Baal HaTanya, the Shulchan Aruch Harav, ruling that it is appropriate to adopt the Chumrah, the stringency of the second opinion, which is if the coal were swept or covered with ashes, everyone agrees that it is permitted. Gechalim she'amemu או שנתן עליה נאורת של פשתן, if there are coals that they are dim, or on which the strip of tiny beaten flax was placed, so it's permitted to leave a pot on a stove whose coals have dimmed or covered by a strip with a tiny beaten flax. It's equivalent of being covered with ashes. Now we learn a very important concept in halacha, which you see it a lot in practical halacha, which is mitztamek veyafelo. Rambam, Hilchot Shabbat chapter 3, also Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim 353, mitztamek veyafelo. In a case where food shriveled and improved when left on the fire, for example, on a stove where the coals are neither swept nor covered with ashes, it is prohibited to leave it on the stove, even if it was placed on the stove during the day. On Friday, it is permitted to do so only when leaving it on the fire causes the food to shrivel and the taste is to deteriorate. Kira she'sikua bagefet u'ba'etzim. One may place a pot of cooked food on Shabbat Eve on a stove that was lit with pumice or wood, even if the coals were not swept or covered with ashes, as long as the food does not shrivel and taste does not improve, because the minute the taste improve, it's a problem. Now, tomorrow, Mitzvah Shem, we'll elaborate on that and go to the next step with this background, which, remember, it's the very important, the background of understanding Shehiyah, understanding Chazara, Garuf, Ktum, Atmana. Now we go to the whole issue of Bishul b'Shabbat, Hamevashel b'Shabbat, one who cook on Shabbat, or if one shachach k'dera, if one forgot a pot, what exactly the halakha. That's the discussion of tomorrow.
Rabbi, I have a question specifically, practically in today's terms. When we use a blech, since that's indirect heat, is that equated to or equivalent to a kira that has been banked and covered with ash?
Good question.
Or shoveled and covered with ash?
Good question. There are a group of very strict friend of mine. They call themselves Chazonishnikis, people who follow the great Chazonish. the great Rabbi Karelitz. They required to have, even at the top of the hot pot or at the top of blech, some type of item, like a small rock, like a container, like something in between that it will not have direct connection in any form. Everybody else disagree. Everybody else, not follow that stringencies. We, in a practical manner, said, I don't know how equivalent, because I wasn't, I didn't live in those days, so I can't attest with the exactness. But I can tell you that the minutes you have the blech, the stove turn on in advance, and it's in the temperature that maintain the same temperature, and you put the ready, fully cooked food in advance before Shabbat on a blech, you can go ahead and use it with certain condition. As we said, one of the condition is that if you take the food and you put it back without putting it on the ground, or for example, you're not megis. We need to elaborate on that in the future, but megis meaning, imagine in those days when we are in yeshiva, so there are some students that 3 in the morning, they are very hungry. So it's a huge pot in the kitchen. They go there 3 in the morning, and they try to take some part of the food and the big pot. Now, the top have something that they're not so interested, like potatoes. But inside the pot, they have, for example, kishke, which they likes in those days, right? The problem, if you take a large fork and you try to get in and pull out that part, you basically megis, you basically turning around the product, destroying it. And then it's an issue, because again, the product is standing on, in some way of halakha, direct fire. Even you have a blech, or you have a hot pot, but it's direct fire because you're changing the status of the food while they are on the fire, even with the separations. So that's again a subject we need to discuss. But you see, in a very general term, the blech is the way that if the temperature is stable and you're picking out the food, not with the intent to return it, you can go ahead, and the food is fully cooked before Shabbat, you can go ahead and use it. Thank you.
Riboinula,